Welcome back. Our last speaker today is Dr. Jessica Allen, an assistant professor at Eastern Washington University. She earned her PhD from the City University of New York and the New York Botanic Garden, and was a postdoc at the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow, and Landscape Research. Her research broadly focuses on lichen conservation and genomics, and this afternoon she'll tell us about urban lichens, symbioses in the built environment. Jessica?
Okay, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here today. It's been so fantastic to hear about all of these exceptional plants in really exceptional places. And I'm going to talk about an exceptional place that's a lot closer to home for many of us. Indeed, we are in the exceptional place that I will be discussing today, really focusing on urban centers and especially the Northeast Megalopolis. Now, urbanization has been increasing for centuries now. We're at a point where over half of the population on this planet, human population that is, lives in an urban conglomerate, and that trajectory is projected to continue. We're looking at over 60% of the human population likely living in an urban center by 2030. This rapid rise in urbanization raises a lot of intersectional and interdisciplinary questions about science and society, the arts, humanities, business and politics, and biodiversity sciences. Indeed, urban centers really sit at the nexus of current modern human civilization. And these urban environments are extreme, especially when we compare them to surrounding natural areas and to the natural environments that existed in these places before these cities were built. They tend to be hotter. We have the urban heat island effect, which is fairly complicated and not, universal in every single city. But in general, we see situations where cities are multiple degrees hotter than surrounding natural areas. They tend to be drier. They tend to have very high disturbance regimes compared to the surrounding areas. And in many situations, there are higher levels of pollution and emissions. Despite these extreme situations in urban centers, these really complex landscapes are home to a lot of biodiversity. So we have some incredible examples like red-tailed hawks, barred owls, snowy owls, coyotes, living in urban centers. Plants can be incredibly diverse here as well. So for instance, in New York City, there are over 2,000 spontaneously occurring vascular plants, 70% of which are native. And we study urban biodiversity to understand what species exist in these environments, to understand how we might better support biodiversity in these environments and how they react to anthropogenic change. And in turn, we get a lens on ourselves, on our society, and how these urban centers really influence us as humans. And I would argue that of all of the groups of biodiversity that can tell us about these urban centers, lichens provide some of the most nuanced and most interesting perspectives. Now, lichens are not plants, but they are exceptional. And what they are these obligate symbioses between fungi and algae. And both of those partners have to live together to form these beautiful and diverse organisms, some of which we can see here on this slide. They come in all sorts of colors and shapes and sizes. There are over 20,000 described species of lichens. The names apply to the fungus. And lichens have evolved at least 10 times independently across the fungal tree of life. They occur on every single terrestrial ecosystem on this planet, and they perform numerous important ecosystem functions in those places. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated than this. So if we were to dissect a lichen, and based on a lot of modern research, we see that not only are there those two main symbionts in these organisms, but there's a really diverse community of endolichenic fungi, of bacteria, of microinvertebrates. There is a lot going on there, and some people have started calling them miniature ecosystems, for instance. And if we were to take a cross-section through here, this is what we would see. Lichens have layers, much like a cake, and you'll see, for instance, that they keep their algae in a really distinct layer. This facilitates photosynthesis in many ways. Another way that we could look at this, these miniature ecosystems, is if we imagined diving into a lichen and actually shrinking down and experiencing what that might be like. Now, this illustration was made by Jordan Hoffman, and I think he really captured the spirit and the imagination of what that might look like, where there are all of these diverse organisms living together and interacting in this complex symbiosis. Now, lichens are sometimes, really highlighted as extremophiles. Indeed, there are a lot of species of lichens that live in some of the coldest or the hottest and the driest parts of this planet. Some lichens have been sent into space, exposed to all of those wild conditions out there, brought back to Earth, rehydrated, and they're like A-okay. And that sort of extremophile nature of some species of lichens is really incredible. Most lichens, however, are really sensitive to human impacts, to anthropogenic impacts. And by studying them, we can get a really nuanced perspective of human impacts on ecosystems and on these species. Indeed, this is why lichens are really commonly used as indicators of air quality and for biomonitoring worldwide. And this is one of the reasons they're such a great group of organisms to study in urban areas. My research on urban lichens has mostly focused on the Northeast Megalopolis, in which we are now sitting if you're here in person, and probably some of you online as well. So this is the region that spans from Washington, D.C. to Boston. It's the most densely urbanized area in North America. Over 50 million people call this home. That's about 17% of the U.S. population, despite it occupying about 2% of our country's land area. In addition to it just simply being such a densely urbanized area, something that makes it an incredible living laboratory for studying urban biodiversity is that there's a really detailed baseline for the organisms that lived here and all the way up to the present. So we can find that information in natural history collections and in the published scientific literature. And so today I'll talk specifically about the history of lichen research in New York City, the heart of this region. So we'll start back in 1819 with John Torrey, a notable botanist from that era. And Torrey wrote a really nice catalog of plants in the vicinity of New York. If you make it through this publication, towards the very end, you'll find a section on lichens. And in writing this document, he did note that he only included the lichens that he could satisfactorily ascertain. So he has somewhat of a preliminary checklist here that included 61 species. Shortly thereafter, Abraham Halsey, who was a banker on Wall Street and a colleague of Torrey's, published a more complete list, and he discovered quite a few more species in that era of New York City, looking at 191 species. He also made a statement that I very heartily agree with. He said that notwithstanding the great progress which the science of botany has made in this country, the cryptogamic branch of it still suffers under the most unmerited neglect. So that includes all of these wonderful organisms that don't necessarily produce flowers and seeds. Okay, so we have a long gap here in this timeline, and the next person who comes into this landscape is Charles Wood, who was a graduate student at the New York Botanical Garden. He ended up really expanding the geographic scope that he was studying when he was looking at the lichens of this region, and he expanded that radius to 100 miles around New York City. And in that study, he discovered 51 species at that time. Again, we fast forward quite a while to 1968. And at this point, Ernie Brodo completed a really elaborate study of lichens of Long Island. Now, if you're lichen initiated at all and you've ever seen the Lichens of North America book, Ernie is the first author on that fantastic resource. He was actually from New York City. He went to City College as an undergraduate. And for his dissertation, he visited all of these sites across Long Island, documented the lichen diversity and abundance at every one of these places. And he was kind enough to provide some really fun photographs from this field research that he did. You can see him singing folk songs at Stony Brook National Lab there on the top and sailing across the Sound on the bottom. Now, he collected at 3 sites in King and Queens County, and he only found 8 species at that point in time. Okay, where are we at now? How many species are in New York in this modern time? So while I was a graduate student at the New York Botanical Garden, not too many years ago, I was invited to join a BioBlitz with the Macaulay Honors College, which was organized by Kelly O'Donnell and Lisa Brundage. And I had the opportunity to go collect lichens in Central Park. Now, I hadn't really looked for lichens in urban areas before that, and I was thinking, okay, let's go find the maybe 3 things, 4 things, there can't be too much diversity there. And in a single day, with a lot of undergraduate students in tow, we found well over 20 species without even trying that hard. And this was kind of the initiation of a longer project, really studying the lichens in the city. I had the opportunity to work in Fresh Kills Park at another Macaulay Honors College BioBlitz with Natalie Howe, and this is a capped reclaimed landfill where we actually did find lichens. So it was just full of surprises, all of this work. I also looked at herbarium records, looked at more recently published literature, and I revisited a few of Ernie Brodo's collection sites to see what was going on there now. So after all of that, I ended up with a list of 106 species in New York City that had been reported or observed since 1968. Okay, so with floristics research, it is a bit hard to say, what do these trends mean necessarily, but we can at least, especially because all of the geographic distributions of these studies are different, things like this, but we do see a pretty clear trend here of a decrease in lichens through the 1800s. I propose this is probably due to the development, the building of New York City, the conversion of natural areas into the built environment. And then that continued decline in the 1900s was likely mostly driven by air quality issues. So by the 1950s and 60s, there were multiple really severe air quality events that caused the mortality of many people. And after that, with the advent of the Clean Air Act and many state and city ordinances, the air quality in New York City is much better today. And I would argue that it's both that improvement of the air quality and the longer term stability of all of these structures and places for lichens to grow that have allowed them to return and flourish. Now, we do have maybe some more robust scientific data about lichen that really evidences lichens return to the city. So by visiting the same place at multiple time points, we can see that at least in a few sites across the city, over time, there have been an increase in the number of species there. Okay. So now I'll take a minute to just look beyond those numbers and think about what these species actually are, what kinds of lichens we're dealing with, and which species have been lost, which have persisted through all of these changes in New York, and which species were lost and then have recolonized the city. Now, we do know, again, from all of that baseline data, that New York City did at one point have a really thriving, really diverse community. This was documented extensively by early naturalists. And based on those data and this published literature, We know, for instance, that here's a species that has been lost, Usnea strigosa. It was lost quite early on. This is what it looks like growing in a really natural area. Here's a historical collection from Long Island, and actually it hasn't been observed in the city since the 1800s. There are a handful of species that seem to have made it through everything. So an example of that would be Cladonia caespiticia. This is quite a small lichen. It was even present in Ernie Brodo's surveys, just barely making it into New York. And here's a picture of it now from Central Park. You'll notice that it looks very different from the way it looks in a more natural area. This is a phenomenon that we call city morph. So in these really stressful environments, lichens look a lot different. And it can sometimes be hard to match them up to how they look in natural areas. But there they are, there it is hanging on. Some species were clearly lost and have come back. An example of that would be Flavoparmelia caperata. This is one of the most common lichens throughout eastern North America. Some people call it the 40-mile-per-hour lichen. And there it is, growing in its natural habitat, clearly documented early on and still present today. Indeed, it's quite easy to observe the species in New York. And here's what it looks like when it grows in the city. Now we have some even stronger evidence, again, from Ernie Brodo's research that suggests that indeed it may have been actually completely extirpated from New York. So he conducted a transplant study where he brought this lichen from farther out on Long Island into New York, and he attempted to grow it there, and within 4 months, all of the individuals were dead or dying. However, all is not lost. We do have some species returning. So for instance, we have the species Usnea mutabilis here, again, growing in a natural area. And my colleagues Jenna Dory and Jordan Hoffman actually found this species growing in Woodlawn Cemetery recently, and this individual was really tiny. So they ended up doing DNA barcoding to figure out exactly what it was. Subsequently, multiple other individuals have been found. So I think this is really hopeful. I think it speaks to the potential for, again, continued recolonization. Now, there's a fair bit of species overlap between New York and some of the surrounding areas. But if we think about those communities, they're really different. Besides the overall composition, even when we look at those species that they share, the abundances are quite different. So for instance, these three species, Candelaria concolor, Physia milligrana, and Flavoparmelia caperata, can be observed easily in most urban areas and in many natural areas across eastern North America, but they tend to be much more abundant in urban centers. So especially Candelaria concolor, Physia milligrana will completely coat the bases of many trees throughout cities. And if you look for these species in a natural area, they tend to be not as abundant. So in a way, both the composition and the abundances of these lichen communities in cities are really novel and really different. Okay, so another question arises, and this is something that while I was living in New York and starting to look at these lichens, I started to wonder about if we could actually bring them back on purpose. So I was wondering if the air quality and the conditions in the city had improved enough for these species to return, and it was just a matter of dispersal. Maybe they just needed to help getting back. So with James Lundemer, I conducted a transplant study of 2 lichen species, bringing them from the Pine Barrens in New Jersey to the Thane family forest on the grounds of the New York Botanical Garden. One of the species was Cladonia subtenuis, this lovely reindeer lichen. Here's a picture of it growing just across the water in New Jersey. You can see it forming these mats along the forest floor. Here's James nestling it into a tree trunk there, and about 6 months later we went to find them and they were either all gone or dead. So this was not a successful transplant. There was a lot of kind of animal activity around there, so I'm wondering if it was a combination of the conditions there and perhaps the large squirrel population. We also transplanted Usnea mutabilis. This lovely fruticose lichen. Again, unfortunately, it did not make it. None of the individuals survived. So based on this information and the observation of street trees being planted in the city from outside of these urban areas, and the lichens, in some cases slowly dying over the course of a year or two, it seems that lichens assisted recolonization is maybe not in their future here, and instead they really need to come back on their own. Given a stable substrates, given improvements in air quality, they are slowly recolonizing. Okay, so now urban lichenology, or studying lichens in urban centers, is actually a fairly large field. There's a ton of research globally in cities, on every single continent, that look at the biodiversity of lichens in cities and extensively use lichens for biomonitoring and for especially air quality monitoring. Here's just like skimming the surface, just a few species and the number, or a few studies with the number of species. However, there's still a ton of outstanding questions in this field. So, and I'm thinking about this mostly from an evolutionary standpoint, right? So I wonder if there are any specific fungal or photosynthetic partner genotypes that have really adapted to these urban conditions. And I think more interestingly, are there combinations of that main fungal partner, the photosynthetic partner, and their entire microbial community that really thrive in these urban centers? And how are those lichens different from the lichens in more natural areas? And then I would wonder about looking at specific genes or gene families that might be under selection in populations in urban centers. I'm specifically thinking about things like desiccation tolerant and the genes tolerance being a very important aspect to thriving and surviving in cities. And what does selection on these genes look like? And again, which genes might be under selection? And then I think really interestingly, and what I'm very excited to keep an eye on over the next few decades, is how these communities change over time. So, cities tend to be in a lot of flux. So we have further development in these areas. We have increased population. We have things like climate change, also clean energy initiatives, or maybe in some places, maybe in others, air quality is actually decreasing. And so taking all of these different factors together and looking at them in places that are actually really easy to access and really easy to study, it'll be fascinating. So I am excited for that, really looking forward to it. Now, if you're interested in learning more about urban lichens, there is a resource that exists. And I recently published a book along with my co-author, James Lendemer, and our photographer and illustrator, Jordan Hoffman, that kind of is a one-stop shop for getting started with urban lichens in northeastern North America. And so in this book, there's introductory material, some basic information about lichens, some really interesting lichen stories in there. And then there are treatments for 60 species with photographs, and photographs specifically taken in New York City, so that it's really illustrating that city morph, so that it makes this book very usable. There's also a key, and there's an illustrated glossary, and the key is fantastic. James put that together, and it's very effective for identifying lichens with just a hand lens and nothing else fancy. So if you're interested in learning more, I would point you towards this book. And I have a lot of people to thank for supporting this research that I presented for you today, and especially the publication of our book on urban lichens. So the whole team at Yale University Press was fantastic, and I'd especially like to thank Jean Black, our editor. She was a huge champion of this book, and I cannot thank her enough. We had publishing we had support for publishing this book from a number of organizations listed here, and I really am grateful for that. And then, of course, many collaborators, many partners, both organizations and people that have helped support this and continue to inspire a lot of this research. And thank you all for tuning in and for loving lichens.
So we have a question online from an anonymous attendee. Could birds be taking the Usnea for nest material? And if you suspect so, have you tried protecting any transplants with wire mesh?
Well, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, so birds do use Usnea along with a lot of other lichens to build their nests, and I would bird nests covered in lichen or made completely from lichens are really fantastic to see. And you know, I have never even thought of trying that, but I think that could be really helpful. And especially, I think the Cladonia transplant illustrated that, you know, these lichens, which in a natural area are really maybe abundant and accessible to a lot of biodiversity, when there are only a few and far in between in an urban center, they might become a hot commodity. So, yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that thought.
Hello, I'm curious with the urban landscape changing so much. Like to compare sites such as the High Line, which is an old infrastructure, but then redeveloped recently. And then I also saw pictures from Greenwood Cemetery, which is much older, and older trees. So how do you navigate the differences in those types of sites? And especially when like species are coming back, and say our species in Greenwood, have they persisted and are they super old? Or I'm just like fascinated by that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like that you point out the High Line in that, because I think that is a great example. So the newly remodeled, really fantastic part of that's accessible to the public is, at least the last time I was there and I searched intensively, it was completely, you know, like a lichen desert. There were no lichens there. It was a much, you know, a very new substrates in that newly developed part of the park. That study that was cited there, which was, that was focused on a undeveloped, more wild part of the High Line, and an area that hasn't been kind of impacted by the improvements for public access. And I think that really speaks to the role of more kind of wild spaces in urban settings, like unmanicured, unmanaged, small, even very small woodlots can be really, really harbor a lot of lichen diversity. And even so, for instance, in the study that I did at Fresh Kills with Natalie Howe, the place where we found most lichens was just like off to the side. Most of those lichens was off to the side of one of the capped mounds in this little scraggly woods of mostly Robinia pseudoacacia that kind of, maybe was like a relic of, you know, just at the edge of the landfill. So yeah, it's really, I think, down to finding those wild spaces in those urban settings. And then you mentioned, for instance, Woodlawn Cemetery.
Greenwood, but I'm not familiar with Woodlawn.
Oh yeah,
sorry.
Greenwood
That's
Cemetery.
Okay.
Anyways, all of the cemeteries are fantastic places to find lichens on all of the substrates there. Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah, another question online from, just disappeared, from Jean. Have you done any specific research on air pollution tolerance?
Yeah, so that is a field that is not within my expertise, and I have not studied air pollution. However, there are so many lichenologists and actually national programs focusing on wide-scale lichen community sampling, especially throughout many national forests, where probably, hundreds of lichenologists have at this point gone out and sampled the lichen species that are present, along with their abundances at thousands of sites over many, many decades, and that has informed, our knowledge of air pollution and especially things like nitrogen deposition versus sulfur-based pollutants across all of North America. So.
That's another question online from Joseph. Are lichen species associated with specific tree species or specific rock types?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most lichens tend to be fairly general in their preferences for trees. You might see a preference for deciduous trees versus coniferous trees. But as far as like species specific interactions, there aren't that many examples. Lichens that grow very specifically only on one tree species tend to be much more rare. So in our example of that would be Arthonia kermesina, which only grows on old growth Picea rubens in the southern Appalachians, very rare species. And then as far as rock type goes, you really see a difference between calcareous rock versus non-calcareous rock, which is really an interesting thing in the city because all of that cement really has a very different chemistry potentially than the surrounding area, depending on what city you're working in. And so that ends up meaning that one of the most common urban lichens is Caloplaca feroxissima, the sidewalk fire dots. And I would say that if you walk out on almost any sidewalk, you could probably find this species. It's quite small, so you might have to get down on your knees and really look for it, but it's probably there.
I think we need to get to the panel.